and I continued the trend that I pointed out in the black and white videos of each region starting with Unova, getting progressively more and more influenced by their real-world counterpart. So yeah, for the first real time, Kalos is very obviously trying to match northern France one-to-one in broad strokes, meaning there's the major city of Paris/Lumios right in the middle, smaller countryside towns built around chateaus in the south, and more mountainous, icy locales to the east. Based on what I know, it's pretty accurate. So if you get a kick out of Pokemon regions being more like Galar and Alola in terms of matching up to the real world, then Kalos is definitely for you as well. But accuracy isn't necessarily what we all want in a Pokemon game. As a setting of a Pokemon game, I think Kalos does its job adequately enough. A lot of these locations feel a bit half-baked, particularly the towns and the cities that aren't Lumios. A lot of them really feel samey, and they rely on the same French aesthetics of the countryside, rivers, cafes, and of course, beauty. A lot of these locations clearly run with the theme of beauty, since of course that's the most prominent theme of X and Y. But that's really all they say about the region and its people, which I think is a bit of a cop-out. We have locations like Dendemil, which feel carelessly thrown into the upper third of the region with nothing but a fancy windmill defining the town. We get a giant rock sundial on this lake town with no explanation about its history or function. It feels like virtually every town or city in this region is one note, meant to convey to us that this is a place full of beauty, full of fancy people who like shiny things and not much more. Relying heavily on themes and aesthetics like that isn't a bad thing, but every other Pokemon region has a better mix of town types, even in games with very cohesive themes. I'd rather venture through a game that offers Icky Town, Holly City, and Po Town than ones that give me Camphreer, Sand Saloon, and Kuraway. They all kind of blend together. Basically, I just wish that Kalos' urban design had more to it than just being beautiful places full of cool artifacts that have vague ties to an ancient war. Sure, it's easily identifiable as a simplified interpretation of northern France, but it doesn't quite go far enough to feel like a rich location in the Pokemon world. However, where Kalos' cities fail, the roots do not. I know I just complained about the cities feeling a bit hollow, but I think the routes actually feel pretty rich. A lot of the routes contain cool landmarks that serve as satisfactory small nods to lore here and there. Things like the standing stones near Geosenge Town, the flower gardens and fountains that line Route 4, the reflecting Crystal Cave, even the Pokemon Village area later in the game. Those are all pretty memorable in subtle ways. And it's nice to know that Kalos included these things in a region with such a plain overall natural landscape. Sure, there's a desert and a pretty snowy area, but there's nothing that really stands out in the same way that Unova or Hoenn does in terms of extreme environments. So it's nice that Kalos feels like an overall believable place, full of cohesive and pleasant paths that wind through woods, meadows, and countrysides, letting small landmarks enrich it along the way, whereas a lot of other regions with plain routes feel comparatively empty. But on the topic of cohesiveness, there's only two parts of Kalos that really bother me geographically. Firstly, why is there a massive desert in the northern part of this country, right between stretches of beaches and the biggest city in the region? It just doesn't make sense to me, and it really does look unnatural in the overworld map as well. Secondly, the way the environments are designed in the last third of the game make no sense. Why do we go from this wintry windmill town with an actual ice cave and a massive blizzard route, then immediately to a really warm looking lake town and normal routes again, before the final gym is in a really snowy town placed right in the middle of the southern part of the region? They rationalize it by saying that the cold in Snowbell City comes from the inside of the gym, but it just doesn't make sense. They should have swapped Anastar and Snowbell cities in my opinion, so we stayed in the big snowy area first, then went back to a more temperate environment. I feel like modern Pokemon games have a trend of throwing in extreme environments like desert or icy areas just because they can for whatever reason, without thinking about how it might come off as jarring. I like these in more extreme and diverse feeling regions like Alola or even Unova, but for places like Johto, Galar, or most of Kalos, I think it would be nice that the charm of the region actually came from its comparative plainness, if that makes sense. Now, while I do like most of the routes in terms of visual design, I would actually go a step further to add that they mostly hold up in terms of game design as well. The games as a whole, starting with Unova, get a lot of hate for an increase in linearity, which as a general trend I do agree with. However, Kalos is underrated in that aspect. There are many layers to some of these routes, with branching paths that you can access with your roller skates, by surfing, by using cut or strength, or even just by looking a bit harder. There are hidden items and TM moves to be found on a fair number of routes, They really do beef up exploration and even incentivize it. The routes here are actually much closer to the Generation 1 through 4 philosophy than they are to Alola or Galar's cutscene-ridden hallways. I feel like the routes in Kalos, by and large, offer some of the best existing HM compromise in mainline Pokemon, where you only really need to teach the core Strength and Surf to your team to really take advantage of side stuff. I just wish there were more outright explorable side areas than just Terminus Cave, Azure Bay, and the Lost Hotel. But these locations are pretty damn good, offering new Pokemon, items, trainer battles, and general atmosphere of their own. People complain a lot about the pacing of the game, but that insanely long stretch between the first and the second gym is absolutely my favorite part of the game, where it really opens up, and you can catch several dozen new Pokemon species, you can ride a Rhyhorn, venture through caves, explore a castle, get fossils, get a second starter, and see like 5 different towns all before your second badge. There's just so many rich options in terms of stuff to see and stuff to do, and I love it. Route 8 in Kalos really represents this feeling the best, with such a wide variety of Pokemon to catch and see and ways to get around. It really has that open road, rugged adventure feeling that I love in Pokemon. There's always that moment in a Pokemon game where you really feel like your adventure is hitting its stride. That moment is here for me, and it's just a shame that the rest of the game doesn't capture this feeling quite as excellently as that stretch between badges 2 through 4. Even the first super linear Pokemon region, Unova, managed to balance urbanism and futurism, with a high degree of nature and ruggedness on nearly every route. So too bad Pokemon X and Y couldn't quite keep it going, since the ride Pokemon routes here fall flat due to linearity and tedium of using them. And a lot of the routes are dense in terms of landmarks and items, but also fairly short. However, none of this stuff even matters if the core aspect of the game isn't that great. The Pokemon themselves. The new designs themselves of any given generation are heavily critiqued and are often used as the ultimate determiner of whether the generation as a whole was successful. I have never bought into that approach, specifically for a game like X and Y where there are so few new Pokemon, so they don't factor in as much as Black and White, for example, but I'll briefly go over them anyway. By and large, this small batch is very high quality. If I had to generalize, I'd say that these designs overall feel more mature, like they really understand how to make an appealing Pokemon without taking a huge number of risks. Generation 5 has a lot of goofier Pokemon that are kind of exaggerated both in design and concept, to mixed results for many. But in Generation 6, it feels like they're only sticking to what they can guarantee works. The Pokemon virtually all have a pleasing, relatively predictable colors, body types, expressions, proportions, and personalities. Like they're all composed of the attributes that make a Pokemon cool. All of the staple Pokemon from this region as well, I'd say are pretty good, with some of the best ones following that idea of making a composite cool Pokemon without making it too bland. It's hard to explain, honestly. It's funny because I kind of feel like Unova and Alola were the recent generations that took more leeway in making outlandish, creatively liberal designs, whereas Kalos and Galar tried to make a tight bunch of Pokemon that feel a bit more rugged, powerful, plain, and solid. A lot of people have made great videos about how the Generation 8 designs go back to the basics of Generation 1, in terms of relying on simpler designs, generic expressions, and less saturated colors, but I've also noticed that Generation 6 Pokemon seem to do this as well. And that's about all I can say on the new actual Pokemon here. I honestly feel like discussing them again isn't that important since they made up such a small part of the X and Y experience. So let's get into that. Whether you like it or not, Kalos absolutely started a new era of Pokemon expansion, where the number of new Pokemon was vastly reduced in favor of alternate methods of providing something new without outright creating new Pokemon. In newer games, we've of course gotten Gigantamax forms and regional variants, but in Pokemon X and Y we got Mega Evolution forms. Now one could argue that this is a good thing, because this cuts down on the number of Pokemon in the Pokédex, and thus reduces the number of filler or outright bad new designs that people seem to think about past generations. However, it's also discouraging that as time goes on, we've discovered that this really means that each generation will only bring us about 60 to 80 new Pokemon, with 15 to 20 dispensable new forms of some kind that are packaged in a gimmick or a mechanic that will be left behind in subsequent games. So far, regional forms are the only ones with any proven staying power, and honestly they're my favorite. Even if every regional form isn't available in the next game, at least it makes sense. Like, I'd rather see a great design survive no matter what. But I think the worst case scenario is leaving some regional form behind works to enrich the world, since it just goes to prove how unique each and every region is to the point where they have their own exclusive batch of adapted Pokemon. But I digress. We're here to talk about Pokemon X and Y. And if we're judging Mega Evolution as an art style, I mean, crucify me for saying this. I never really got the hype behind these designs when they were revealed, and I think it's a bit overrated. Like, I think at least with Gigantamax forms, which I also don't like, they at least have clear inspirations that put a twist on the original Pokemon, like Giant Sea of Garbage, Skyscraper, Chunky Pikachu. With Mega forms, I just feel like already cool and imposing Pokemon just got slightly exaggerated, like bigger claws, pincers, drills, whatever. It's too fanfiction-y for me. Like, what does it really add to these Pokemon's concepts? I love base Garchomp. If anything, this Mega form just looks uncomfortable and kinda tacky. But moving on, because I think the Megas resulting in a lower number of new Pokemon actually resulted in something else pretty neat. More than pretty much any other Pokemon game, save for Black and White 2, the distribution here in Kalos is absolutely fantastic. Sure, there weren't many new Pokemon, which makes a lot of routes hard to find Kalos Pokemon, but they really went the extra mile to beef it up and make sure you could get a fantastic team of both newer and older Pokemon. Like, right off the bat, this has the largest pool of available Pokemon before the first gym of any game. Kalos doesn't really let up with interesting Pokemon at each and every turn, unlike a lot of other games where your team is just your starter, the early route ones, plus maybe a solid rock or normal type one for about a third of the game. Here in X and Y, you can get all sorts of interesting and powerful Pokemon even before your second badge like I mentioned earlier, plus a myriad of fossils and an extra starter. Just from my anecdotal evidence playing the game, a lot of Pokemon both new and old are available in fairly reasonable ways too, with patches of grass just having a huge diversity of encounters. It makes encounters random and team building feel truly limitless, more so than most other games. It makes X and Y pretty appealing options for challenge runs, like monotypes or Nuzlockes, since you can end up with a different team almost every time, filled with both new and old Pokemon. It's pretty fun, and I remember doing a lot of those in X and Y's heyday. And that's not even mentioning Wonder Trading, which was a very accessible feature where you can instantly connect to the global internet and send off a Pokemon from your party or PC in exchange for totally random Pokemon from someone else. Taking advantage of that was fun for these runs, or even just in hopes that you'd get something cool to use or fill out your Pokedex with. I will always remember the Pokemon distribution in Pokemon X and Y fondly because it just works so well. So now, like I warned earlier, there's some negative stuff as well. That's kind of the point of this video. Not necessarily to be negative for the sake of it, but it would be dishonest to recount the rise and fall of Pokemon X and Y without mentioning the ways in which they fall short. So strap yourselves in. Arguably, the biggest flaw of this game was its story. Like I mentioned earlier, the theme of Pokemon X and Y is beauty, and it's prevalent throughout the game, both visually and somewhat through the story. Characters will talk about beauty, NPCs will remark how beautiful this or that place is, and of course Team Flare won't shut up about how they want to preserve beauty in the world by killing literally everyone. Wait, what? Yeah, Team Flare isn't all that amazing of a villain team, and Lysander is also half-baked as a villain. I discussed that in depth in a video that I'll link here, so go check that one out for the full rant. But I will say this, I think Team Flare and Lysander could have been good enough villains to match the story and its themes, but they just aren't in their current forms. Basically, Lysander explains throughout the story that he feels a deep-rooted insecurity about the world as it is, the fact that he perceives impermanence, or the idea that beauty does exist but the actions of greedy and selfish people are a major threat to it, one that makes beauty such a finite thing. In turn, the player learns that he and Team Flare seek to wipe out humanity as it is and create a world for themselves, seemingly noble people who are the only ones capable of upholding a forever beautiful world, since in his mind, no other solution is available. As such, the story explores somewhat interesting themes about being a misanthrope, the idea that someone perceives such a deep flaw with the current way of life, and they align radically against it. Lysander kind of comes off as a three-dimensional character after all. He doesn't want to be the way that he is. He feels pain with it. We see him shed a tear when he discusses wiping out Pokemon for his perfect world, but he still intends to go through with it, showcasing how he sees his goal as something noble, inevitable, yet something challenging to go through with all the same. He's a loner, a self-appointed savior of a world that he thinks only he can see the flaws with. Sound familiar? Only one problem: there aren't really any flaws with the world that we see, nor is there seemingly a limit to its beauty. Kalos, as we know it, is an incredibly wealthy and homogeneous population of Pokemon and people who seem to agree on the same values, again, of appreciating beauty, alongside other values of the Pokemon world. This is shown through their food, their architecture, their achievements, and even leisure. There's nothing to show us in Kalos that this way of life has left anyone behind, nor is there even a sign that this way of life is unsustainable. Yeah, Pokemon games have never really dived into darker sides of society, except maybe Kanto, kind of. But this would have been the real perfect opportunity to do something along those lines. If the game gave us a villain so radicalized against the world, so entrenched in his belief that beauty was either unequally distributed or a truly finite thing, why not flesh out the world a bit more to support that? To at least give some legitimacy to this anxiety espoused by Lysander. Yeah, I guess you could say that Lysander takes a page out of the Thanos book, and is the type of villain who is so radicalized and ego-fueled, coming up with an elaborate solution to a problem that only they can see, making them true madmen. And I guess that's fair and interesting, but not really enough for me. I would have much preferred a version of X and Y in which Lysander remained roughly the same, but we saw more blight in the world. More evidence that Lysander maybe did have a point, that there were indeed signs that human achievement and beauty had reached an unsustainable point, and it could result in collapse. Something well worth finding a solution for. It would have been awesome to see these problems at hand. Maybe inequality, corruption, pollution, consumerism, climate change, all firsthand on your journey, and see other characters with perspectives on it, before meeting Lysander and his radical solutions, one where he wants to kill everyone, or something a bit less extreme but still kind of objectively evil in the end. That would let the player feel something, a sense of true nuance and conflict. While we would end up stopping Lysander all the same because his solution would just be evil, just like any other well-written villain, it would influence and change us, and other characters like the Professor, Rivals, or Gym Leader. While stopping a villain with a tendency towards violence would remain the same, it'd be nice if along the way we learned that maybe they kind of had a point. Maybe they were only brought to such a radical point because something in the world desperately needed change, and they were the only ones gutsy enough to do something about it. To give another Marvel comparison, Killmonger from Black Panther. Those are some of my favorite types of villains. Too often in Pokemon games, I think the games don't force a challenging perspective. They don't really let us think that the world of Pokemon is anything but perfect, and the villains should automatically be stopped because they're trying to change something about the world. Maybe we, the protagonists, should be the ones recognizing that something does indeed need changing, and maybe we should affect that change ourselves. Even if you get the good old-fashioned stopping villains along the way thing, at least let us be influenced by their perspective, learning from it so that we can achieve a more nuanced solution. That's a much better lesson to send to kids, I think, than just people seeking solutions are automatically bad. And yeah, you can take this with a grain of salt because I do like the relatively utopic nature of the Pokemon world. The fact that it's a franchise that I can melt into and feel like all is right with the world. I mean, real life is hard enough, damn it. But at the same time, I can't help but feel like I wouldn't really mind if just one in every 3 or 4 generations earned the right to be a bit more mature about the Pokemon world. I think Pokemon X and Y would have been excellent candidates for this, and they would have been so much memorable for it. So yeah, Team Flare kinda sucks, but it gets worse from here. First, I think it would be remiss not to mention another prominent NPC, AZ. And I mean prominent just kinda, because he shows up at literally 3 points in the game, and I think is meant to enrich the whole narrative about the Pokemon world and the Ultimate Weapon, because he was a scientist who created the Ultimate Weapon himself, 3,000 years ago to end the Pokemon War, since he was so upset that his beloved Floette died, so he didn't want any more conflict in the world. And that's definitely an idea, I guess. I mean, it plays into the idea of war, grief, and destruction, all things that could be seen as opposite to Lysander's themes of committing to beauty and a solution. There are parallels between them. Both of these men are driven by obsession, and they don't see that their drive for beauty results in a lot of death and destruction along the way. I mean, AZ even shows up in Lysander's lab at the climax of the story to caution Lysander against following down the dark road of obsession, or else Lysander will end up cursed and unsatisfied just like AZ did. Again, it's an interesting idea. I like the concept, but it just doesn't go far enough. Do I have an immediate solution to this? No, that's best reserved for another video, but for now I'll say this. X and Y feels so frustratingly close to a deeper, darker story for a Pokemon game, one that I would have loved. There's shreds of it, between Lysander, Team Flare, AZ, the war, the weapon, and the world itself. However, all of these things should have just been developed more to work harmoniously as one storytelling unit, conveying many themes ranging from beauty to destruction. On top of that, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to complain about one last part of X and Y's story that also really bugs me. It's the utilization of the two box legendaries, Xerneas and Yveltal. Visually, these guys are great. I quite like the cutscene where they appear in the lab, and the battle is quite epic as well. And their Norse mythology concepts are great on paper, but unfortunately I think their integration into the game's themes, or lack thereof, is another major missed opportunity in Pokemon X and Y. Xerneas is meant to serve as the literal embodiment of life energy, and Yveltal is the opposite, which is death. I can kinda see how they play into the two themes of the games, with Xerneas being an embodiment of beauty, life, and richness, and Yveltal being an embodiment of death, destruction, and violence. But man, how lame is it that these two legendaries barely play a role in the game? They really just amount to Lysander wanting to use them like batteries, and drain their energy for his version of the ultimate weapon. So we really only see them once at the end, and that's it. Plus, these two represent a duality in much of the same way that other great legendary duos do. Pairs like Kyogre and Groudon, or Zekrom and Reshiram. And guess what? With those, we actually see those dualities in-game, with great cutscenes of those two pairs of godlike Pokemon at odds. Why don't we see that here? All we get is one of them, depending on the version you're playing, locked away in a lab for about 45 seconds before you can catch them. They aren't even shown or mentioned at other points in the game. They don't feel integrated either in the game's plot or the internal culture of Kalos as a region. No one really seems to mention these guys, be aware of them, or care. Heck, Kalos even has statues of the previous generation's legendaries. So all of this, a lack of rich world building, a refusal to deepen mature themes, poor integration of the legendaries and villain team, all lead to a game that feels halfway done. We could talk about how the return to a truly global product for Pokemon resulted in a rush game that feels incomplete on a technical and difficulty level, like the fact that there's no post-game and most of the major battles feel uninspired, but I would end this part of the video by saying that X and Y also just feel creatively incomplete. To me, these read as games that don't have much of a vision to begin with. No matter how much time was put into development, even newer games that come off as even more rushed, like Sun and Moon or Sword and Shield, at least feel like there's a richness to the worlds being established, or a purpose to the story being told. Alola is steeped in the atmosphere, with the region's history and traditions visible at every corner. Meanwhile, Galar is literally oozing with flavor from the gym challenge, everything from the music to the stadium selling the epicness of this experience really well. Even places like Ultra Space or the Wild Area just do more for the region. My point is that even the most hollow Pokemon games have at least some pride in their aesthetics, and that's not really something I can say for Kalos for all the reasons I discussed. These just don't feel like creatively confident games. So we did it. That's where X and Y stands, both its build-up and the game itself. However, I think there's one last chapter to discuss before we close out this book, and that would be everything following the game. Well, not literally everything. Not even the next games Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. That's its own topic. I just mean, what did X and Y immediately set up as a precedent for the franchise? What, if anything, was a lasting element of these games, whether good or bad? I also think that's worth mentioning to round out this undoubtedly lengthy video. The Kalos game started a precedent in a few areas of the Pokemon franchise that are persisting problems to this day. Honestly, I won't go too in depth because so many people have kept this discussion going in videos, particularly post Sword and Shield, but since they began here in the Kalos games, I think it's fair to point them out. I'd say the most apparent issue is just Pokemon becoming too easy. It's a thing a lot of people have pointed out that I generally agree with. And as I mentioned earlier, it's proven to have been a stated goal of Game Freak developers around this time to make the games more accessible to a mass audience. This was the first Pokemon game with a new experience share system, so that makes the games pretty easy if you're defining easy as less grindy and easier to be overleveled. So that just makes X and Y feel like a shorter, lower pressure experience than other games, especially since I played these games many times with the experience share off. Yes, you can do that here unlike Sword and Shield or the Sinnoh remakes, luckily. and they were somewhat of a challenge, but still not really, because the trainer AI and the boss fights just aren't that beefed up. I'm also not really railing on the experience share system or anything major like that, since at the end of the day it's not really an issue that began with X and Y or even games following X and Y. The games have always been flawed because they've never given us a choice in difficulty. It's just easier to notice that the games are inherently too easy and you can't do anything to make them harder than it is to notice when the games are too hard and you can't do anything to make them easier, if that makes sense. It's hard to be super specific here with what easy means because it's different for everyone. I mean, we all want different ways for our Pokemon games to be more difficult. That's not something I'll even dive into here. I'll just leave you with this. Pokemon X and Y were the first time where I felt like my Pokemon experience felt somewhat unearned. What I mean by that is that X and Y kind of started this thing in the franchise, dating back to what I said earlier in the video about providing big flashy stuff like Mega Evolutions or extra starters. Stuff like that began in this game, free handouts at random points just to make the games feel more exciting. Was there any logic to getting an extra starter, or one with a free Mega Stone? Not really, it's just cool. Was there any logic to an extra Lucario? Again, one that could also Mega Evolve? Not really, it's just cool. I'm not saying Pokemon shouldn't be cool and have moments that reward you like that, but Generation 6 absolutely started a trend of certain powerful Pokemon just being way too accessible, to the point where it just doesn't feel special to obtain or use them. Combine that with the universal experience share, and I feel like for many of my non-challenge restricted playthroughs of X and Y, I just couldn't get into it, because I had so many rare and powerful Pokemon who didn't even see the light of day in battle. This continued into Sword and Shield, where I felt like I was able to catch fully evolved rare Pokemon in the wild area and blast them with experience candies, the universal experience share, even candies that would just boost certain stats or change their nature. And look, I get it, I'm an adult with a job and not as much time for Pokemon as a time sink, so I appreciate the lack of grindiness on one level, but I also want cool and rare stuff to actually be cool and rare. X and Y is when I felt like my teams became less memorable because they got better and they got cooler without me having to do nearly as much. I preferred having a mediocre Lucario raised from a random egg that I got in the Iron Island side quest in Pearl than I did getting an OP Mega Evolution one before my third badge here in X and Y. It all just felt way more unearned, and X and Y isn't nearly as bad as the more modern games. But my point still stands, and I think it's fair to point out. The second precedent thing worth just briefly bringing up is the stagnation of the general direction of the franchise from a visual standpoint due to that whole thing of future-proofing. Everyone knows that the models have been the same, just slightly upscaled in each game, since X and Y. So it's a bit depressing to know that since 2013, the highest grossing media franchise in the world has used the exact same battle animations that have remained virtually unchanged. But again, that's not really X and Y specific, since discussion around this topic really centered around Sword and Shield, since that's when the issue became really apparent to the community. So I guess with that, I think we've done it. I think I've said everything that I have to say about Pokemon X and Y. I suppose I should sum it all up. So I'll just say this. These games deserved better. Their overall mediocrity was a product of many things. Their rushed development, Pokemon watering itself down as a brand, not taking faith in a deeper story, themes, and characters, and obviously not making a Pokemon Z, which would have undoubtedly fixed a lot of things. That's something I would have done in this video, but I already explained how it fixed many of Pokemon X and Y story elements here. Plus, if you're interested, let me know down below. And if enough people want it, I may be interested in doing a visual novel type of video to show my ideal version of Pokemon Z, similar to Nando V Movie's Rise of Skywalker fix, if you've seen that and you know what I'm talking about. But the past is the past, and for now Kalos is a closed case. This video has helped me resolve a lot of my own frustrations with this region, and I appreciate some aspects of it, even a bit more. And you know what? I'm always going to remember what we got somewhat fondly. They're certainly not my favorite Pokemon games, but they really did come out at the perfect time for me. I'll always remember the build-up to Pokemon X and Y, how that started the second chapter of my love for this franchise, one that aligned with my entry into high school, a time when many of my interests were changing and newer ones were replacing them. However, the hype for Pokemon X and Y, followed by my playing of these games, proved to me that my love for Pokemon didn't need to go anywhere as I grew older. I have very fond memories of enjoying weekend days at the neighborhood library with my friend, just wonder trading and hoping we'd get something good in return. I remember being so excited to get off school and do some Wi-Fi battles, because it was just so accessible in these games. I remember watching countless videos from various creators on these games and Pokemon as a whole. And though I was still 5 years away from posting videos to this channel, I have no doubts that the Pokemon X and Y period was the beginning of my interest in being a content creator and sharing my love for Pokemon with the world. So for all those reasons and more, I will always remember Pokemon X and Y for what we got. Are they worth remembering as a whole? In some ways, yes. But for me at least, making this video was at least a very cathartic experience. My own way of moving on from blindly accepting the games as they are, a naive feeling rooted in my own feelings of nostalgia, and how fondly I remember my life when these games came out, and instead moving on to the Pokemon fan that I am now, which is someone older and who has a Pokemon YouTube channel, a somewhat widespread voice in the community, at least I'd like to think, with a feeling like I should be more outspoken about objectivity. So thoughtful analysis and criticism can be a thing in this fanbase. So thank you Pokemon X and Y for existing, and thank you viewers for tuning in and embarking on this progress of remembering and maybe moving on with me. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this very long-winded retrospective on Pokemon X and Y. Like I said, I have interest now in making a Pokemon Z video at some point, so let me know if you're interested in that. Also, if you're new and you like what I have to say about Pokemon, welcome. I have plenty of videos on the topic, including my very own region project, Pokemon Carbon and Silicon. Go check that out. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time for more content.
Hello, my beautiful friends. I'm here today to talk a little bit about The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. From the moment I first started it up and emerged from the Shrine of Resurrection, I knew that this was going to be a very special game. So perhaps unsurprisingly, when I finally got around to reviewing it, I really wanted to give it my all. I wanted to talk about nearly every aspect of the game, from its triumphs to its failures, and everything in between. As you can probably tell by the length of this video, I did just that. There may be a few tiny stones I left unturned in the end, but it's really not many. For the most part, if I had an opinion on it, it came out. Now, I've been calling this a review, and you'll hear me continue to refer to it as such throughout, though I'm not completely sure that's accurate anymore. I mean, technically, yes, here I'm doing largely what one does in a review. But when I hear the word review, it makes me think of game critics telling people their thoughts on a game so that those people can make more informed purchasing decisions. But that's just not what's happening here. Or at least I'm willing to bet that's not happening a whole lot. By now, most people have either played Breath of the Wild or decided that one day they will play Breath of the Wild. And I'd also bet that most people who are willing to watch a video this long on the game are probably not in the teeny tiny camp of people who are still trying to figure out if it's right for them. This is more of a breakdown of the game's design, a critique of all its pieces, sort of review, sort of analysis. So I've recently decided to rebrand this kind of long-form analytical deep dive look at a game to separate it from my regular reviews, thus the title. This review of Breath of the Wild has become a big fat review of Breath of the Wild. A seemingly subtle change, but I think it makes a big difference. Originally, this review slash big fat review what have you was released in 7 separate parts, but here I've compiled them all into one long watching experience. Each part is mostly the same as it was when originally published, though here and there you'll see a few notes and addendums popping up on screen. Not a ton, so don't worry about missing them or anything, just a few bits of info I felt should be added. And naturally, seeing as this is a nearly 3.5-hour video dissecting every element of Breath of the Wild, I'll warn you now that yes, there are spoilers ahead. All of the spoilers, in fact. As I said, when writing this, nothing in the game was off limits, and that included all the mechanics, all the enemies, the story beats, and even the final boss and ending. Also note that while there will always be visual elements to accompany the voiceover, including the aforementioned notes, and maybe a handful of gags that you have to see to get, for the most part you can probably just listen to this whole thing without having to watch. You know, if you're into listening to me talk about Zelda while you clean the house or drive across the state or something. With all that said, I think it's time to get started. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present to you my big fat review of The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. When Breath of the Wild was first revealed back at E3, back when we still referred to it as Zelda U, I watched the reveal teaser. Later that year, I watched the precious few moments of gameplay gifted unto us at the Game Awards. 2 whole E3s later, they gave us the full reveal trailer with the game's name and basic mechanics and some monsters and locales. And that was the stop of the Breath of the Wild preview tour where I got off. I did not want to see any more. Unfortunately, stuff inevitably slipped through the cracks. Whenever a juicy new trailer popped up in a Nintendo Direct or something, I always peeked between my fingers here and there, and sure enough, every time I did, something was spoiled and I regretted it horribly. I've talked about this before, but if you're not aware, I am hypersensitive to spoilery material. To me, a spoiler isn't just, this character dies at the end, or it turns out it was all a dream. To me, a spoiler is anything that I would have delighted in discovering for myself. If I know everything there is to know about a game going in, every kind of guy I'm gonna fight, every item I'm gonna get, every place I'm gonna see, a lot of the magic is gone. The simple act of playing out a video game isn't the only important thing to me. I want a game, especially a game as huge and important as Breath of the Wild, to be like an experience, an event in my life, something special. So I went in as blind as I reasonably could as a guy who talks about games on YouTube. And I'll tell you right now, I'm so glad I did. Breath of the Wild is obviously a great game all on its own. Spoiler alert, by the way, it's a great game. But I'm not exaggerating when I say that an immeasurably huge amount of my enjoyment came from not knowing much going in. While I basically never like to know too much about any game, avoiding spoilers had never before meant as much as it did here. And that's because no other game I've played has contained such a wealth of delightful things to discover. You see, I'd always dreamed of this massive game where you could just go wherever you wanted and the world was beautiful and magical and you'd actually find interesting stuff. I would run through the world of Shadow of the Colossus thinking, this is so close. It was visually spectacular, it was enormous, it got my imagination running wild, but beyond 16 colossi, which you had to hunt down in order, and I guess like fruit and lizards and stuff to eat to increase your gauges, there was simply nothing to find. It was just a set. A really big, beautiful, amazing set, but a set. There was nothing really to do except enjoy the scenery. And of course, some other open world games have gotten close to delivering what I wanted. Take a game like Skyrim, for instance, which is huge, beautiful, filled with quests, and completely open for you to explore at your own pace. It's hard to pin down exactly why Skyrim didn't quite do it for me. I loved it, but it didn't contain that certain kind of magic I was looking for. It could be because most of the game boiled down to killing guys and looting them. Find a cave or a dungeon or a sewer or anything, run through it and kill the guys and grab all the loot. Plenty of surprising stuff to come upon, and that's why it was certainly close, but something was still missing. Breath of the Wild, though, is the game I was waiting for all those years. And really, it's surprising that it turned out that way. When Aonuma claimed that the Great Plateau, the huge, sprawling area available to play around in at hands-on events, was only about 1% of the total map, I think more than a few of us grew a little concerned. I mean, how much stuff can you possibly develop for a world that big? How can there be enough to actually do? Because it doesn't matter if a game world is 1,000 miles across if you're just running forever and not finding anything. But the Zelda team pulled it off. They made the world beautiful and teeming with interesting geography and ruined buildings and just a wide assortment of unique sights to happen upon, and they also packed it to the gills with dudes to kill and stuff to loot. But the two things that make Breath of the Wild the game I always wanted to play are shrines and Koroks. And I think it's because, for one, they're just all over the place. 120 shrines and 900 Koroks in the world is just packed with them. There's no place in Hyrule where you'll just not come upon shrines and Koroks, meaning that no matter where you find yourself, you're always on the hunt. But more importantly, though, they so perfectly satisfy my exploration craving because they strike a balance between useful and fun to find. See, if useful stuff is scattered everywhere and all you gotta do is pick it up, it's not as fun. The game becomes a collectathon at that point. The idea is just to kind of waste your time. But then if there's stuff that actually takes thought to find, but that stuff isn't really that useful, then, well, what's the point in looking for it? Also much less fun. Shrines and Koroks, though? They're perfect. Shrines because they give you spirit orbs, 4 of which can be exchanged for either another heart container or an extra bit on your stamina meter. Hearts mean more here than they have in any other 3D Zelda by far, and stamina aids in your ability to move through the world, climbing higher surfaces and gliding further primarily. And of course, each shrine is just a fun challenge to beat, which we'll touch more on later, but that's what makes them even more satisfying to find. Then Koroks are great because they increase the number of weapons and shields you can hold, and in this world of breakable stuff, this just makes them stronger. It takes more and more Korok seeds for each pouch upgrade, and you'll be maxed out after getting roughly half of them, but as long as it's making any difference at all, I am pleased as punch to obtain each one. And let's talk some more about why the finding of these things is so much fun, starting with shrines. Out of everything the game offers, shrines keep things the most interesting. They provide the most unique scenarios. They require so many different things of you to be uncovered. It can be rolling a snowball on the right path down a hill so it crashes open a door, lighting some inconspicuous torches, tracking down and taking pictures of statue fragments, defeating a family of Hinoxes, getting a group of Rito kids together to sing a song. The list goes on and on and on. I can't even properly describe how awesome it felt to set foot on Eventide Isle, or in that one place where it's super dark, or in any of the Great Labyrinths. It was such a huge rush. It was the sense that I'd discovered something really awesome and was now faced with some sort of fun challenge. Some of these shrines offer nice loot, but for the most part, the prize is always the same: a spirit orb. Again though, I never care. Spirit orbs are incredibly useful, and earning them by doing all this crazy stuff just makes the whole thing that much more fun. It's this feeling of constant reward no matter where I'm going or what I'm doing. And you know me, I feel that variety is the spice of video games. If all the shrines are fun and interesting to find, the fact that they come in so many different packages just multiplies that fun. Plenty of them, of course, are simply sitting in plain sight, and this is great. It's something of a palate cleanser between trickier shrines. You don't want to get completely tired of solving riddles and doing obscure stuff, and it's great that you can mark them from a distance so you can just come back to them later when you want to accomplish something a little more straightforward. Plus, seeing them from towers is just exciting. Whenever you stand up on a tower you've just unlocked and you spot all those red blobs all around you, you're invigorated by the task at hand, by the idea of pressing into a gigantic new territory. But, of course, even better, there's this unmatched sense of wonder when you're just running around in the mountains doing nothing and you see something weird and you go, what on earth is that? And you investigate for a while, then wonder turns to joy and triumph when you realize that yes, it's a shrine! My first time through, I especially loved Cass's riddles. Most of them were pretty easy to solve, but there were a few that made me feel awesome when I got to the bottom of things. If I had to pick a favorite, it would probably be the one where you have to find a spot where you can shoot an arrow through 2 of those stones with holes in them. I love to sit around and ponder in any game. I love to stare at a problem from all different angles and think about it for a while. And of course, that was a challenge that was so unlike the rest of them. There were so many that were so unlike the rest of them. Next, of course, we've got the Koroks, and it's funny because they're so much less flashy and substantial than shrines. I mean, with one, you've got a jillion little structures rising up out of the earth and taking you down into a trial to test a legendary hero with all sorts of weird magical technology. And with the other, you've got the rock, and it's like, poof, haha, you found me, here's a seed, bye. But the effect these little creatures had on me, especially in the early hours of the game, was immense. If shrines instilled within me a sense of wonder, Koroks instilled a childish delight that was just as strong and just as magical. Just like with shrines, this is largely because there are just so many of them hidden throughout the world. Outside of the Divine Beasts, there is no place in the entire game world where you can't find some Koroks if you look hard enough. It means that running through nearly my entire experience with the game, there was this constant knowledge that